Hey, what's up, photographers? I wanted to talk to you today about camera support and the different options that I use in the field. Tripod, the one I use the absolute least. Monopod, one that I used to use quite a bit and I'm using less now. I have a ground pod down here, which I'll show you how to use in a little bit. I still use that semi-regularly. And then the one method that I use the most right now, which is handheld. Thanks to these mirrorless lenses and cameras a little bit, I would say. They are much lighter and I'm able to handhold them most of the time. Even when I'm using my heavier 400-2.8, I pretty much handhold that almost exclusively. And other than a few certain circumstances where it does make sense for me to go on the monopod, and the rare time I will go in on a tripod. So, advantages and disadvantages of both. All right, handheld, okay? It's the most freeform, right? It's the easiest. It's also the cheapest. You don't have to buy anything. If your rig is light enough for you to comfortably handhold, by all means, go for it, okay? I can get my lower perspective, higher perspective, move left, right, really easy, turn around, track stuff. Everything's nice and simple. The one disadvantage it has over any other support system is I can't go quite as low a shutter speed, quite as low. You can get really low though, especially with even the DSLRs and a modern lens with good image stabilization on it, you can very likely shoot lower than you anticipate. It's one of the things I suggest you do is actually see how low you can consistently get some sharp photos. For me, with this setup, both with this lens and my other bigger, heavier lens, I've consistently, I shouldn't say consistently, but I have shot down to 1/10 of a second handheld. That usually means I have to find myself a nice stable platform, whether it be down low like this on my knees or even laying down with my elbows as a nice base. I usually can't stand up here like this, just kind of free hand holding and get 1/10 of a second, but I could easily probably do 1/60th of a second or 100th of a second, no problem, with a setup just like that, okay? That's for me though, it's different for everybody, so figure out your comfortable shutter speed. All right, the next support system I would use would be a monopod. You don't have to spend a lot on them. This is a carbon fiber one. I do recommend that just because they're light, which makes it nice. And basically you just clip in, right? So I do have a monopod head on here. There are a few options for heads on these. This one is a Wimberley, let me see. This is an MH-100. And what's really cool about this is you can see, number one, how compact this head is. All right, it's basically just this little thing right here, okay? But here's the nice part about it, right? As long as you have a rotating collar ring on your lens, you can loosen that up, rotate so you're nice and horizontal, and then all I have to do is loosen this, and look, I can point it in any direction I want. When I have a proper long foot on here or a heavier lens, I can basically balance this so that I can just let go of it anywhere I want. So I can point it up and let go, point it down and let it go, and it just stays balanced. It's basically like a gimbal. Whenever I'm shooting a monopod, I always leave my collar loose, so that way I can rotate to vertical, number one. But number two, if I want to change my perspective this way, take a note, look at my camera, see how I'm staying horizontal with it, okay? I'm not, like if I have this locked and I lean, look what happens, my camera tilts, okay? But if you leave your collar loose, you can stay perfectly horizontal while you move around. Advantages of a monopod. Number one, I don't have to hold my camera all day and all night, right? The monopod is supporting the weight. So if I'm going to be standing around shooting, let's say birds in flight or something like that for a long period of time, I will still use a monopod just so I don't have to hold the camera the whole time. Some other advantages of this are really easy ability to just change your perspective, right? I can turn really easily. It's easy and light to pick up. If I wanted to shoot up in the air, I can. Usually not the best perspective to shoot, but whatever you can. And here's the other thing. I can support the weight, and look at this. I can lower my perspective and still have the monopod kind of supporting the weight for me, okay? So I can come up here and then quickly lower and still stay supported, especially if I have a heavier rig on. With a lens like this, it's really odd to use a monopod, but with a heavier lens, it certainly makes sense, okay? Or if you just fatigue easily with whatever your rig is, the monopod is just a wonderful solution for that. It's cheaper than a tripod and way more flexible than a tripod. And it's a great support system and one that I used with my previous DSLR setup and my 500 f4, which was heavier than my current setup is. So that's the monopod. Next, let's hit the ground. All right, so the tripod, the ground pod. What I usually use on my ground pod is the gimbal head off of what I would use on a tripod. So here's a ground pod, right? It's basically like an upside down Frisbee. A lot of people make them out of a frying pan. You have a bolt that comes out of it. you will likely want some sort of head. You can technically screw the camera right onto this, but it's really, really not good to use that way. So I put my gimbal on. I am gonna lower the plate on my gimbal so it's at its lowest position. So that's a key step right there. And then I'll mount my camera in just like I would any other way. Again, I am going to loosen that collar ring because, especially like here, I'm on a sloped ground. I want to be able to rotate that to stay level, but I can loosen this so I can spin, and then I can loosen that and I can tip. So I can basically move any way I want in any direction, and it supports the camera when it's a low perspective. So shorebird photography, shooting on the beach, shooting in the marsh, something like that. If I was shooting some, let's say some ducks or waterfowl out here and I didn't want to hold my rig the whole time, this is the ideal setup. It's light enough and portable enough that you can pick the whole rig up and just walk around with it. But the nice thing is, especially if you're shooting in some shallow water, it keeps your camera up out of the water and off the beach sand as well. So you don't have to hold it the whole time, okay? So that is an advantage of the ground pod over being handheld. And then on mirrorless cameras, I use it all the time, the flip screen. I can just flip the screen out right here, loosen this up, and then I'm ready to go. I don't actually have to lay down and get my eye in the viewfinder like I used to with the DSLR. So in any case, the ground pod is certainly a great support system for that. And it is still something, one of the tools that I'll use occasionally when I know I'm going to be in and around water a lot and I don't want to have to hold the rig the whole time. Okay, so the last support system that I use is the tripod. And give me one sec, we just have to get this gimbal back up on the tripod. That was a cool move, wasn't it? I just spun that thing right off of there. All right, so we'll get the gimbal back on the tripod and we'll mount the camera up onto that. One of the things I see often is with gimbals, I see a lot of people put the controls on the right side. It doesn't make much sense to me to do that because you shoot with your right hand. Even if you're left-handed, all cameras are pretty much right-handed. So your hand is over here to shoot with. And if I'm locked in like this and then I want to unlock or change my position, I have to either reach over or let go and use my right hand to do that. It doesn't make much sense to me because I would think most of the time you'd want your controls on the left-hand side here. And that way I can keep my hand here ready to shoot, support my camera, and then freely unlock to tip and unlock to rotate or lock and just keep shooting, right? So my hand is free here to kind of work those controls. So I would suggest it that way. But in any case, advantages of a tripod. The most stable platform you can get. I can do really long exposure, so slow shutter speeds on this, and you don't have to hold it at all, right? Just kind of like the ground pod, I can just walk away from it. I don't have to touch the thing. So if you're gonna be shooting the same area for a long period of time, this is a great setup for that. It's also pretty easy with a decent gimbal head to just kind of have a nice fluid movement to the camera so you can track subjects and things like that. So when do I use a tripod? When I'm sitting in a hide for a couple of hours at a time and I don't feel like holding my camera. And I know I'm only gonna be shooting in, say, this direction or just kind of out in front of me. Tripod's perfect. I'll sit down in a chair, put the tripod over me, it holds the camera for me the entire time and I'm good to go. Or when I'm shooting video, I want a nice stable platform for that. It can be better for that, obviously, versus handheld or even on a monopod, you still get a little bit of shake. Disadvantages of a tripod. It is not easy to move or change perspective. Okay, number one, I have to kind of walk around it if I even want to just shoot a different direction. Not that big a deal, but it's still annoying. It's easier to do with a monopod. You just spin around the stick, okay? And then the other thing is to change height. If I wanted to make this thing lower right now, I have to actually loosen 3 legs, lower them all, try and lock them up again and hope I'm relatively level. Doesn't have to be perfect, but I generally want it level because if I'm really crooked, as I pan around here, my camera is changing all sorts of angles, okay? So I generally want to be somewhat level when I'm on a tripod. And yeah, I just generally find them completely unnecessary with today's cameras and stabilization. Other than a time where you're just going to be shooting the same area for a long period of time, then a tripod makes sense. But other than that, I find them just very cumbersome, in the way, not easy to modify what you're shooting. Perspective changes are awful with it. And yeah, I just kind of think they suck. So that's my thoughts on all the support systems there. So for me, I would say in the last year, I've been shooting almost exclusively handheld with a very minor mix of my monopod and a little bit of ground pod action when I'm going to be shooting in some shallow water for some time. Other than that, handheld's the way to go. So if you can do that, I would say do it. But whatever support system in the end works best for you is obviously what you should stick with.